Group, the Baron Legg. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, fellow opponents of the Maastricht Treaty. It's now 20 years since we tried to save Europe from the catastrophe that is now unfolding. We failed in that endeavour, but we did succeed in setting in train a process which saved our currency and turned the people away from ever closer union. When I sent out the invitations to this dinner, I received the following reply from Sir Peter Tatchell, the father of the House of Commons. It read, "I have always regarded my part in the opposition to the Maastricht Treaty as being the thing of which I am most proud in the course of my 53 years of parliamentary service. Peter, none of us can match your record of parliamentary service, but all of us can agree with those sentiments. Those of us that oppose Maastricht did hold some widely differing views, and none of us were easily subject to persuasion. But in this matter, we had one thing in common. We simply knew that in making our decision, we had to put our country first. To be driven by an abstract concept is not something many people find easy. And I believe that it is no coincidence that the forebears of many of the Maastricht rebels had served their country in its hour of greatest need. And indeed, some had made the ultimate sacrifice. When I was elected to Parliament, April 1992, I fulfilled a long-standing ambition. But my overwhelming emotion when I came to Westminster was one of foreboding. I knew that our membership of the ERM was a ticking time bomb, and that the Maastricht Treaty would put me at odds with my own government. In my maiden speech, I argued that we must be free to set our own interest rates, and of course, that could only be done outside the ERM. But over the following months, both the Chancellor and the Prime Minister declared that there was not a scintilla of doubt that sterling would remain in the ERM. On the 16th of September 1992, the inevitable occurred. The markets terminated Britain's membership of the exchange rate mechanism. It was a great day, sir. It was great news for the economy, but it was disastrous news for the Conservative Party. Its reputation for economic competence, which had prevailed for 40 years, was destroyed. Our standing in the opinion polls plummeted and never recovered. But not even this disaster could dissuade our government from pressing ahead with Maastricht. Now, many on the Conservative benches shared our views, but ultimately they were not prepared to act. In June 1992, we sponsored the Fresh Start motion, which in the wake of the Danish referendum called for the abandonment of Maastricht and the advancement of the ideas contained in the Bruges Group's speech. Some 80 Conservative backbenchers, around half of those available to vote, signed our motion. But 4 months later, on the 4th of November 1992, only 26 of us remained who were prepared to truly act upon our convictions. It was not quite enough. We fell short by 3 votes. Maastricht was to proceed, and the opportunity to make a fresh start was lost. Now, Peter Tapsell, in his opposition to Maastricht, was able to draw on his experiences dating back to the 1930s. You, Peter, I, and many others quite rightly compared the proposed single currency to the gold standard and saw that it had the capacity to bring forth economic depression. How right we were. Peter, you even recounted to the House of Commons a conversation which you had with Winston Churchill late in his life, when he told you that his biggest political mistake was to return to the gold standard, a bigger mistake he considered than even that of the Dardanelles. We also told the House of Commons, you also told the House of Commons, that one of your earliest memories as a boy was of standing in the dole queue with your father and remembering the humiliation that he felt at being in that dole queue. What you saw and experienced in the 1930s is now being played out across Europe. In Greece, Spain, Portugal, and elsewhere. Indeed, the economic consequences are, in some areas, are even more extreme than in the 1930s. 25% of Greece's economy has been wiped out by this lunacy. The peoples of southern Europe are suffering extreme economic deprivation. And when all of the conventional parties offer the same prescription, extremist parties stand to flourish. Ladies and gentlemen, at the time, people called us Little England. But the truth is that we believed this treaty was not just bad for Britain, but bad for Europe as a whole. We planned to fight a treaty line by line. We had to get across to the British people the profound nature of the changes that were proposed. John Major, like another British Prime Minister 50 years earlier, claimed a diplomatic triumph when he returned from Maastricht. He used the words game, set, and match. But in reality, European government had been set in train. And now a future British government, led by a Tony Blair or a Michael Heseltine, could merely decide to abolish sterling and join the euro. In due course, our prolonged parliamentary opposition meant that the future of the pound became such a crucial issue that both major parties conceded a referendum. In my mind, the currency was then safe. I trusted the British people. If a British government had been able to give up sterling, our country would have been ruined. As happened in Ireland, we would have experienced a mighty property boom, to be followed by the mother and father of all busts. Now, many Conservative MPs told me that if they believed the single currency could really happen, they would join me in opposing the treaty. Indeed, the Prime Minister of the day encouraged the notion that it would never happen. A similar misjudgment to that of a Prime Minister 50 years earlier. Whereas it was possible to accept this argument at its face value, I must admit it is difficult to understand how those who held the highest offices and had regular contacts with the European elite could fail to appreciate their steely determination. Yes, Maastricht left out many necessary aspects of the single currency and European government. But that was not because the plan was not to be implemented. It was because the architects did not wish to show their hand in full. If the treaty had properly included, say, provisions dealing with banking union, that would have frightened the horses, and the project would have failed there and then. 20 years ago, some of us who opposed Maastricht said that instead of adopting this approach, powers should be repatriated to individual member states. Essentially, we were adopting the vision set out in Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech. But if we are honest, we should now accept that Bruges was destroyed by Maastricht. Maastricht was the blueprint for European government to be achieved through the mechanism of one currency. Today, Europe's leaders pursue that agenda. More Europe is still their answer. Since Maastricht, more and more powers have been transferred, culminating in the European Constitution. The argument that a limited repatriation of powers is the solution is now redundant. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now abundantly clear that we would be better off out. Sitting amongst us has actually spent the summer doing that calculation, and he's come up with a figure of £160 billion per year. We should not stay in the European Union if we wish our country and its people to achieve their full potential. More Europe is the agenda of the elite. If we stay, we will be in the same position as Norway. The 17 states who share one currency will decide our future. Many of our current leaders sing the praises of the single market. But the so-called single market is a highly regulated market. Free trade is better than a single market. Indeed, being subject to so many regulations can impede our trade with the rest of the world. That's one of the reasons that we do less trade with China and India combined than we do with austerity-ravaged Ireland. Half of the 160 billion annual cost of our EU membership is due to excessive regulation. We now need to heed Peel, Gladstone and Churchill and embrace free trade. We do not need the straitjacket of EU membership. Like many countries around the world, we should negotiate a free trade agreement. And more than ever, Europe needs free access to our markets. Under the misguided and defeatist leadership of Harold Macmillan and Edward Heath, our global vision was impaired. Let us never forget the words of Sir Winston Churchill to the House of Commons on the 13th of May, 1953, when he said, "We are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked, but not compromised. We are associated, but not absorbed. If Britain must choose between Europe and the open sea, she must always choose the open sea."
Very silence for Mr. Bill Dash Henry.
Welcome indeed to this great moment in the history of the Maastricht Rebellion, which is still with us. Tonight, we celebrate a historic moment in our history. I want to tell you that I sat down this weekend and I reflected on all the millions of words I've read about the European issue. Passions, convictions, contempt, arm twisting, the battles against the establishment and against our own government. I asked myself, why? What's it all about? I came to a very simple conclusion. The word is freedom. Freedom for the people and for our constituents. Freedom from fear. Freedom in the marketplace. And freedom in the battlegrounds. Freedom of conscience. 20 years is a long time. And by comparison, most of the other great constitutional struggles in our history have in fact been resolved in far shorter time. We are still not there yet, but the Maastricht Treaty and the vote on the 4th of November 1992 was indeed a watershed. Although, as in the great Norway vote in 1940, the government won the vote, it lost the confidence of the nation until Churchill took the helm. Looking back over the centuries, the opposition to the Maastricht Treaty, in its undermining of our sovereignty and our parliament, ranks with the parliamentary battle against Charles I in the Civil War over shipmoney and over the divine right. It ranks with the removal of the Stuarts at the end of the 17th century. It ranks with the repeal of Cornwalls and the battle for the Reform Act in 1867 and the vote for the man in the street. It ranks with the battle over Home Rule and the breakaway of the Liberal Unionists over the issue of Westminster sovereignty. It ranks with the battle against the President in the 1930s. All these issues ultimately turn on one fundamental question: who governs Britain and how? All fundamental constitutional issues in the first bracket. This was why Maastricht was so important. It created European government with or without the opt-outs. It was a fundamental step towards a federal Europe that Barroso has now demanded. It demonstrated that the passing of the European Community Act 1972 was based on a great deceit that we would retain the veto. Maastricht represented a fundamental erosion of British political will. Imagine what would have happened had the state of Europe as it now exists and is seen on every television screen in the country and throughout Europe, with all the violence and the unemployment and the disintegration, had been projected into the living rooms of the people of this country and of Europe at the time when the Maastricht debates were being conducted. Yet all this was predicted and was ignored. The all-embracing nature of that act is what is now at stake, as the encroachments on the voters' right to decide for themselves in general elections as voters in this country as to how they are to be governed has brought Britain to its knees. What we are celebrating tonight is a collective act of political will by courageous and principled members of Parliament who, despite the determination of the government and the establishment to induce and bully them into betraying their conscience and their convictions, stood out, stood firm, and laid the foundations for the political war of attrition which has persisted to the present day. People fought and died on the field of battle for our democracy. How much easier is it for us? How much less at risk than those for whom the ultimate sacrifice was the loss of life itself? Looking around this room brings back floods of memories. It would be invidious of me to choose individuals, but I looked at Peter there, and I see Teresa, and I see all those people who joined together with us in those lobbies. This difficult time when people were being pushed, cajoled, and driven against their conscience. Some regrettably cannot be here, but they are not forgotten. Attempts have been made to rewrite the history of those exciting and momentous days, but they will never be able to capture the sense of dedication and camaraderie that existed in Room J, or in Great College Street, or the Maastricht referendum campaign. And I see Russell Lewis sitting over there, and I see Ian Bill, and I see all those who delivered these extraordinary briefing papers that poured into the House of Commons, piled high, and frightened the whips out of their minds as they realised that they would not be able to stop this torrent of words, this torrent of analysis, this determination and this political will. And there was the battle of the whips, including some who now profoundly regret their misguided devotion to the establishment, and all those who ignored our warnings at the time, but cannot now bring themselves to see with clarity the decisive weight of the existing treaties. So where does Maastricht place us now? It is still embedded in those very treaties, and it is the foundation stone of the destruction of our national independence and self-government. It has been embellished. It has been deepened by Nice, by Amsterdam, and decisively by Lisbon. And it has failed. It is riddled with fraud. The accounts have not been signed off for 18 years. And in order to bail out the system, they print money in a never-ending cascade. It has now failed so spectacularly in Europe as a whole, with riots and unemployment as we predicted, the German question, the trade deficit, as compared to our trade surplus with the rest of the world, the massive overregulation of the small and medium-sized enterprises, demonstrates that Maastricht matters as much now as it did on the 4th of November 1992. At last, we are at the crossroads. As I wrote in Visions of Europe, in a chapter called The Brave New Europe, I said, it is this fundamental contradiction between promise and performance which is undermining the community. And therefore the community as a whole, which is falling into a pit of corrosive contradictions. Maastricht, once ratified, can only be unravelled by unanimous requirement, which is to say at least impossible, or when monetary union collapses, as did the exchange rate mechanism, there is widespread chaos with massive political and commercial instability throughout Europe. That is where we are. We are still fighting the same battle, but at last we are at the crossroads. It is worth remembering that we nearly got there when the party united over the Lisbon Treaty, and with the vote to have a referendum, then the cast iron guarantee was cast aside. But there was a revolt, a highly significant revolt, when 55 Conservative MPs voted to preserve our sovereignty, echoing the same amendment proposed by myself on the Single European Act as long ago as 1986. Yet the momentum created by the Maastricht Rebellion, epitomised on the 4th of November, is still with us. We did not vote against the confidence motion at the end of the Maastricht saga for one reason. As I said at the time to John Smith across the chamber, if we had voted with Labour to defeat the government on that fateful night, we would have guaranteed that under his government, after a general election, he would have adopted his failed federal agenda, and we would have been subsumed in the same perils as the Eurozone is now itself. By the rebellion 20 years ago, we established a benchmark against which the change in the Conservative Party and in the country can be measured. Indeed, now, 94% of the British electorate insist on a referendum. And only this weekend, 56% say that we must leave the European Union altogether. Especially after the demand by Bruges and the Euro fanatics for a federal state. They are so willfully blind that they can drive this agenda forward by hook or by crook. The coalition government, and I say that with respect, all of us who are members of the House of Commons at the time, is paralysed, but not only by the Liberal Democrats, but by self-doubt and the Euro elite in the high echelons of government, and also by the desire to retain the peace and content. Certainly, we have witnessed the first veto of any kind since 1972 over the fiscal compact, and in fact. But that fiscal compact is itself unlawful, as was the breaking of the Stability and Growth Pact by Germany and by France, and the first bailout arrangements described by Madame Lagarde as the violation of all the rules in order to save the euro. The proposals for the banking union are also unlawful. What we are witnessing is the breaking in the European Union of the ultimate test of government, namely its own adherence to the rule of law on a massive scale in the pursuit of a political ideology. Above all else, we have now, for the first time in 40 years, I would remind you, won a vote in Parliament over the European budget, with the determination of those of us from the Maastricht days, and new and valiant MPs who have come into Parliament like Mark Reckless. The tide and times have changed thanks to the Maastricht Rebellion, and as I've said to David Cameron recently, the tectonic plates are not merely moving, they have moved and will be followed by a tsunami. And yet the government is in a vacuum without a European policy which has sufficient coherence. The issue cannot be resolved by nibbling at the treaties, nor can it be resolved by pleading for a referendum on what, in my judgment, would amount to a list of demands, which, like running with a hare and the hounds, would concede the principle of the Maastricht framework and deny the consent of the British people by its adherence to European government. As I said at the beginning of my speech about fundamental constitutional change, this is on a historic scale. The time is now right to throw down the gauntlet to the European Union, not merely the negotiations within the existing treaties. As I said at the party conference this year, we must have a referendum before the next general election. At least in 2014, and to run parallel to the European elections. And this must be on the principle of fundamental change in our relationship and the principle of the consent of the British people. Since Barroso, there is no turning back. And you and I and all of us, the British people, have crossed the Rubicon, and in Caesar's famous words, the die is cast. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, still remains on the bank of the river, while the British people have reached the other side. There is nothing that the government can place on the table which the European Union would even countenance, which is why the issue cannot, in my judgment, be about a negotiating arrangement which will simply turn into a posture or smoke and mirrors. The government's position, as I have said to the Prime Minister personally, is like that of John Major's policy on the Euro and the ERM, a policy of wait and see until it is too late. And just as our economy was destroyed by the delay of abandoning the ERM, so will this delay destroy our Parliament and our nation. If he does not act now, and while the arguments rage over this or that, we must demand a referendum on nothing less than the breaking of the fundamental relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. The British people are with us, and the spirit which infused the Maastricht Rebellion and the debate on the 4th of November must prevail. The referendum question must be confined to establishing for the British people what's only trade and political cooperation, back to the common market, and not the legal framework of the existing treaties. We want an association of nation states. We know that the European elite will not listen. As Winston Churchill said, so the government go on in strange paradox, decided only to be undecided, resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful for impotence. This is the vacuum which successive governments have created, and within which this coalition of governments exists as it strives to retain the keys to number 10. The black hole of this failed European project, with its bailouts, the rise of extremism, unemployment, and its total failure of democracy, its bullying, its threats, its failure to deliver the stability and peace which it promised as predicted, is now apparent for all to see. If we do not take a stand, as we did on that November day, we will be sucked into that deeper and blacker dark hole forever. Churchill, as Barry said, stated that we should be associated but not absorbed. Above all else, it was your political will on the 4th of November and in the Maastricht Rebellion that led to the circumstances that now lead us to have the opportunity to save our country. The coalition, however, shows at present insufficient signs of measuring up to the present challenge. So the issue from now on will turn on political will. And as William Pitt said, England has saved herself by her exertions and will, as I trust, save Europe by her example. This is why we must strain every nerve to obtain that referendum before the next general election on the issue of our relationship with the European Union in principle and on the issue of consent. And within the House of Commons, as you yourselves made clear on the 4th of November and thereafter, you stood and defied the whips with courage and foresight in line with the most famous of Churchill's tenets. Country first, constituency second, party third. You will see on your table a poem sent to me the day after the debate of the 4th of November 1992. In its own words, it stated, "The 27th duty sticks, to bear the insults, bear the kicks, but liars hurl honest men, and carry forth their banner when their promised allies fall away, and only truth remains to stay. Fight on, and in the battle's heat, not one should contemplate defeat. A nation holds her breath for you. She cannot speak, but trusts you too."
Chairman, Secretaries of State, ladies and gentlemen. It falls to me to have the great privilege and honour of proposing tonight's vote of thanks to the Maastricht rebels. But if you'll forgive me, I cannot really raise a toast to the 26 Maastricht rebels, because I regard them as Maastricht patriots. Or British patriots. And if I may be in person for a moment to extend the quote we heard from Bill from Winston Churchill, it should be country first, party second, and career last. And tonight we salute the political courage and valour of all of those 26 who put their careers last, who put their party aside and put their country first. Now, of course, we've had our modern day rebellions recently, the so-called 81 rebellion last year. We recently had the 53 so-called rebel MPs on the EU budget. But I'd like to say tonight that as somebody who played a very minor role in both of those rebellions, that I'm just an apprentice. I'm just, if you'll forgive me, a Eurosceptic YTS. I'm just an understudy to the likes of those who went before me and went before Mark Rankus and others. An understudy to all the Maastricht brothers, and an understudy currently in the House of Commons. Again, if I can be in the buttons, perhaps I won't want as an understudy, with John Webber and Bill Cash and others. And gentlemen, I salute you tonight. Just to say briefly, of course, we have the promise now of a referendum. And I recently said to the Prime Minister, congratulations on being a Tory rebel. And he looked rather shocked. And I said, of course, when there was the vote on the referendum, the so-called 81 rebels looking at whether we should have a status quo, renegotiating a relationship with Europe, taking powers back, or an in or out referendum. The government whipped against that vote. But since then, the Prime Minister has conceded and agreed to the principle of a referendum. So tonight, I recognise the 82nd Tory rebel, the Prime Minister. I have to say that the proposition that we currently have of a referendum after the next election, the Jam Tomorrow proposition, falls down at its first hurdle, perhaps. And that is, of course, the Conservative Party has to win the next election. And of course, I hope the Conservative Party will win the next election. But having not won the last election, and having the background of austerity, the task is very tall indeed. Secondly, even if we were the largest party and we continued in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, we know that the Liberal Democrats will continue to exercise their veto over the referendum. That any commitment to a referendum in the manifesto will be superseded by a second Parliament coalition agreement. And of course, the referendum commitment in the election manifesto will be nullified by a similar commitment by the Labour Party. So the political advantage will be lost. So my view is, my personal view is, that we need to have a referendum, an in or out referendum, on the date of the next general election. And it is that decision, a politically brave decision by David Cameron, that I believe will return an outright Conservative majority and will return the independence and sovereignty of our nation back. It is no good going for repatriation of powers, because, to quote a distinguished living statesman, that is the Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, repatriation of powers, as he said in his Chatham House speech, is a false promise.
Sure it is.
It is a false promise. The British people have been deceived for too long. And tonight,
I recognise the patriotism, the valour, the political courage, and the preparedness to speak truth all those years ago. Please raise your glasses to the British patriots, the Maastricht rebels, and let freedom reign.